Hey everyone, thank you for joining us for Indigenous Voices, a Think ND series where you can engage with a legacy of diverse Native American cultures and celebrate the arts and self expression of Indigenous artists who enrich our lives through dance, music, song, fashion, and the decorative and visual arts. I'm Spencer French, poet and PhD candidate in English here at Notre Dame, and I'm really excited to help facilitate this conversation. Jessica, it's good to see you. I'm going to do a
Yeah,
couple more. Yeah, it's so good to see you. I'm going to do some more thank you to some co-sponsors, and we'll get into this after a short intro for you as well. Uh, at this time, I want to thank all the co-sponsors of Indigenous Voices, Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, the Notre Dame Initiative on Race and Resilience, the Racklin Murphy Museum of Art, the Native American initiatives at the College of Arts and Letters, the Native American Alumni, and the Notre Dame Alumni Association. Thank you all for sponsoring this and making this conversation a little more possible. And now to the real focus. Let me welcome Jessica. I get the real distinct pleasure of introducing my friend, Dr. Jessica Doe Mehta, a visiting research fellow at Notre Dame's Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. Jessica is an Aniyunwiya, anti-disciplinary poet, artist, scholar, born on Turtle Island, a term used by some American Indigenous peoples for North America in the Northwest region, also known as Oregon. As a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, space, place, and indigenization are driving forces in her work, which have been described as avant garde conceptualism. She is currently working on a monograph that expands to include modern, contemporary, indigenous, indigiqueer poetics. Jessica has authored poetry collections, novels, and short story collections. She has also enjoyed exhibitions around the globe, most recently at Don Dexter Gallery in Eugene, Oregon. Jessica, thanks for being here.
yeah, absolutely. I'm excited for our talk.
Of course, of course. Now, just looking through this intro, we talked about you're a member of the Cherokee Nation, but
Mhm.
you also speak the word Aniyunwiya. Could you explain some of like the history of naming and why that's really important to have the right language there?
Yeah, of course. So, typically, so-called Cherokees, we often refer to ourselves as Aniyunwiya, which translates loosely to real people or principal people. We have, as a tribe, reclaimed the term Cherokee because it's not derogatory. So, the word Cherokee, there's a few different theories, but it came from a neighboring tribe, probably Muskogee Creek. It might also be Chickasaw. So,
Mhm.
depending on that etymology, Cherokee either meant speaker of another language, which is how one of our neighboring tribes referred to us, or
Mhm.
those who come from the mountains. I'm a member of the Cherokee Nation. There are three federally recognized tribes. There's also the Eastern Band and another one as well, the Spiritual Culture Keepers in Oklahoma.
Mhm.
But for the most part, we, kind of speaking for all of us here, are usually good with Cherokee or Aniyunwiya. It's a little different than some other tribes. For example, my children were adopted from the Oglala Lakota Nation in so called South Dakota,
Sure.
and they are often referred to as Sioux. Sioux was also a term given to them by a neighboring rival tribe, which translates to snake in a derogatory sense.
Got
So
it.
most Lakotas don't really go by Sioux unless it's a reclamation, kind of like the term Indian.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. Um, it's always fascinating to me as a poet and as a scholar of literature like you are, to see how not only language functions, but also to see how it becomes so central to culture formation and identity formation. And so it's a really helpful kind of contextual note that I think really does introduce well some of the many threads that you talk about in your work. So just speaking of those threads, going through kind of your intro, uh, just gonna try to cover some of the things that you do. You're an academic, you're a writer, and when you say writer, for someone like me, it's like poetry and a little bit of drama. But for
Mhm.
you, poetry, fiction, essays, academic writing, mixed media, and then you go beyond writing to sculpture and performance art. I have to ask, like, what compelled you to use all these different methods and mediums? Like, how do you think about
I always say that I consider myself a poet first, that
that?
I think poetry is our, as a human, first and most natural form of communication. I mean, if you look at things like children's books, especially maybe mid-century and prior, it was often poetry. That's what we are drawn to, the rhythm, the cyclical nature, the pattern. So I have poems that my mom had kept that I wrote at 6 years old.
Well,
And so that's the beginning, I think, of how we communicate is through storytelling.
mm,
And I
mm,
come from the first tribe to have a written form of speech, syllabary, and that was created just a little over 200 years ago. So it's fairly new. I see written text and especially poetry, written poetry, as an organic extension of the pan-Indigenous tradition, oral tradition.
mhm.
That being said, I have a bachelor's in literature. I do not have an MFA. My doctoral work was more literary criticism. I have participated as an attendant in 2 poetry workshops in my life.
Hmm.
So when I say I began as a poet, that was my creative journey.
Sure.
And I let myself be boxed in and boxed myself into this label, this title of poetry. That's what I started writing. That's what I published the most in. And while I think we kind of have permission as writers to go into other genres,
Mhm.
and I think that's especially true for poets, I think it's kind of typical for poets to also go into prose, whether you look at Ocean Vuong, Sylvia Plath, and you can really tell when it's a poet writing prose.
Totally. I
And,
completely agree with you.
and
Complete.
it's so good when a poet is writing prose. I think it's trickier the other way around.
Sure.
When there's a prose writer, like, now I'm going to write poetry, you can kind of tell that a lot of the time as well. And, I went into scholarly writing to write about poets and poets that I loved. So that was kind of a natural journey. In terms of more visual work, performance work, installation work, that was a bigger leap and much newer.
Mhm.
And it was kind of just that giving myself permission I don't need to be sequestered into this writing
Sure.
stall or whatever you want to call it. That being said, I made that jump using text. The first thing I really did, that was funded, that was a so-called professional, was painting my poems on human bodies. And then it just
Mm,
kind of
mm.
expanded from there. But text, and especially poetry, is still at the heart of everything.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Your note on poets who write fiction is so well taken. I just read Kava Akbar's Martyr, and
I
that's a
haven't read it
fantastic.
yet.
Oh, it's so good. You have to read it. And the other ones that you listed, Ocean Vuong and other like, I completely agree with you. Now you said something in there that was really fascinating to me. So, I've been writing poetry since I was like 16. I've been writing for over a decade. So you don't have to convince me of any of this stuff. But when I think a lot of people in the broader public think about poetry, it's like usually there's a pipe involved, maybe a tweed jacket, you're staring at some flowers, and it's always in some old dusty book. And what your work does is it helps us think about poetry, and which you if I understand correctly, you kind of see as the origin and kind of animating force behind a lot of your artistic movement.
Mhm.
Um, you see it far more expansively than that. So, um, I was wondering if you could kind of help our audience understand, you know, poetry and performance. Are those different things? Are those the same extension of the same thing? And then also you mentioned as an expression of like the pan-indigenous oral tradition, right? So these things are all moving around and I think they actually really contest some basic general notions of what poetry is and does.
Mhm.
And I'd love to hear your thoughts more on that.
Yeah. So first of all, I love tweed jackets and dusty books.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So this is, I don't know. I sometimes call myself a post confessionalist, bearing
Cool.
in mind that the idea of confessional poetry, even though the person who coined it, Rosenthal, kind of like went back and regretted that decision.
Mhm.
And those who fall under confessional labels, maybe just 3 people, maybe just Plath and Sexton and Lowell.
Yeah.
But that's what confessional poetry is what I first fell in love with. So that's the springboard for me. And I think it's because confessional poetry, at least how I was exposed to it, that was the first time where I saw it's okay to just absolutely purge on paper.
Mhm.
And I wasn't raised in any kind of organized religion, but it was, from a small Oregon town that's going to be threaded through the culture anyway.
Sure.
But I love Christian Catholic iconography. And so I liked that ties to confessionalism.
Hmm.
And when it comes to where poetry is right now, oh God, I don't know, because it's changed so much in the past, I would say like 100 years compared to prior to that. Pros and cons. There was a time, probably mid-century, where poems were appearing alongside articles in, Sunday newspapers. That was the norm.
So it's so true. Yeah.
People were just exposed to it. And like I said, with children's books, that's how, we learn language. Even if we were learning a foreign language as an adult, it's through the rhythm, it's through song. And now in this, I hate this term, the digital age with Insta poets, I think there is some goodness in younger people being exposed to poetry through social media a lot of the times.
Mm-hmm.
We have a lot less gatekeeping, for better or worse.
Sure.
But I don't know, I feel like we're in this space where there's so much of everything, including poetry, and poetry that I'm going to put in quotes. It can be really difficult to be exposed to a wide-reaching range and quality poetry.
Sure.
And hate this word too, diverse poetry.
Yeah.
So I don't know. We're in a strange place, and I don't know where it's going.
Totally. I mean, this brings to mind the class that I just taught at Notre Dame, Poetry and Peace, which you were kind enough to come guest lecture in. And two quick notes on that. The first is when one of the assignments I gave the students was to memorize a poem from our readings in the class, right? And one of the reasons also why you mentioned diverse poetry, with kind of in air quotes, and the reason why it bothers me so much is because I taught an incredibly quote unquote diverse class, but I wasn't setting out to do that. I wasn't like, well, I got to check these boxes. I'm like, no, like I want to teach the best poetry you can. And I found the best poets I could. And it was like, oh, well, like we just happen to be all over the world and all over different kinds of experiences. Right. But so these students went to go memorize this and they hated it. They were like, why is this guy in this, thrifted tweed jacket making me memorize a poem, But afterwards, they all thanked me for it. They all thanked for the memorization, which is interesting how we talk about poetry kind of socially, and then we understand it after having experienced it, right? But that thinking about this reminds me of when you came into class. I wasn't sure if you were going to come in and lecture on Ogalala Lakota poet Lali Long Soldier, or share some of your own poetry, and you did something actually very different. And I was wondering if you wanted to share a little bit about that.
I didn't have a solid plan in place. I mean, I'm prepared, but I like to just let things go however they go. And because my background as a poet isn't this trajectory that a lot of people might imagine it to be, because like I said, I don't have an MFA. My background isn't in workshops or anything like that. I just like to present works of other people that others might not be familiar with or, dive deep into, but then also just share my own journey so far and how I got where I am. And that includes showing visuals from previous exhibitions and shows. Because every single person, whether it's us or someone who's never been to a poetry reading in their life, has an idea of what poetry is, like you said, and definitely has an idea about what a poetry reading or lecture is going to be.
Sure.
And it's difficult for me to kind of backtrack and see through someone's eyes what they're expecting, what it might be. And something that happened a couple weeks ago. So I had a friend visit me at Notre Dame, as you know, and she is a math education professor. And we've been friends for over 20 years. We were in undergrad together. We don't have a lot of overlap professionally. She has previously gone to one AWP conference with me in Tampa.
Sure.
Obviously,
And
she's
what
used to going to a lot of math conferences.
yeah.
Huh?
And what's AWP?
Oh, Association of Writers and Publishers. It's like the biggest, publishing conference in the so-called United States. And this was 2019. We went to AWP, and she said it was so much more fun than the conferences she was used to going to because it's
Mhm.
just a bunch of writers milling
Yeah,
around and drinking and going to workshops and buying books. I took her to the Jericho Brown conversation at Notre Dame, and I wasn't sure how she would respond to it. And he's an amazing, they're just an amazing, I don't want to say performer. I do think performance is always in poetry to
sure.
some degree, and that kind of comes from Anne Sexton's similar stance on that. But she absolutely loved it. She was the
Mm,
only non-poet person in there and said it was amazing, bought Jericho's book. And even though she has no background in what it means to write poetry, it
sure.
still resonated. And I think that she wasn't expecting that. I don't think anybody does. And we think of poetry readings as dry and boring and sometimes
Sure.
complicated and esoteric, and they can be,
Sure.
but not many that I've gone to have been.
Yeah,
Because poets
yeah.
are weird.
Poets are weird, right? No, I love that. And, with Jericho Brown, he has in one of his interviews, he talks about he was seeing this man and the man was like, poetry, I don't really like it. It's like, read on the page, it's kind of confusing. And he goes, listen to the music. And he read it aloud to them.
Mhm.
And this guy was like, "Oh, I kind of get it now." And and that's why I think poetry readings can be so fun, which is also why when you came to class and shared your own work, and then also led a little kind of group writing exercise, it was so moving, right? You put that vase of flowers in front of us and just said, "Just write together for 10
Mm.
minutes." And my students, most of whom are very poetry averse, and one student the other day called poetry embarrassing. He was like
It can
he was
be.
like, "I don't know, I don't wanna read my poetry. Poetry is embarrassing." I was like I had to mark him down 10% for the whole class. But but it was fascinating seeing you lead that, um, because the students walked away really enjoying it and
Mm.
realizing many students went on to write very fascinating poems in the class. So, it was a
Yeah.
good time.
Just having time to write in quiet camaraderie/solidarity, but you're still doing your own thing without the pressure to I have to share this or I have to turn it in. Because
Mhm.
I never push for anybody to.
Sure.
But, writing prompts can be simple, like a bouquet of flowers. And we as humans today, unless it's like us, don't carve out time to write,
Sure.
especially not pen to paper.
Mhm. No, I agree. I agree completely. And now speaking of poetry, I'm I'm looking at in front of me, I have a couple poems of yours from a book that you were working on during your time at Notre Dame called Spread SP Red. And I was wondering, trying to stay on, continuing the theme we're working on, if you could give us a little introduction to this project that you finished during your time here, and maybe even we could get into hearing a poem or two.
Sure. So, Spread has been a work in progress for a while, but it was completed at Notre Dame because I had just supported time to write and create. Spread is an indigenization of what I think is the most well-known or recognizable tarot deck, the Smith Rider-Waite deck. For anybody who is not into tarot, you would probably recognize these images. And it was commissioned by a white British man around 1910, 1913. An white American expat created the series. And it's it's got a lot, but it's also problematic. It's overwhelmingly white. The only figure that might not be white is the trickster. You can infer with that
Yeah.
everything that you will.
Not
Um,
great.
yeah, no, it's fat phobic, it's heteronormative, it's all of those things. But obviously, regardless of what the illustrator personally thought, she was operating and creating during a time when there really weren't any other option.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I wanted to indigenize it. I wanted to personalize it, but I also wanted to flip on its head some of the mostly Christian, some Judaic imagery that's in there and highly recognizable.
Sure.
Now, my own background with tarot is my dad was from the Cherokee Nation. My mom was white. She was specifically the child of British immigrants. And she was my first tarot teacher from when I was a child.
Oh, cool.
And I learned on this deck because that's what was available. I have other decks now, but this is what I use on a daily basis. And I thought, I've been reading these cards for 30 something years.
Sure.
And I'm sure I've internalized some of this imagery, even though it clashes with, because I was brought up Aniyunwiya pretty much entirely. I spent the summer on the res, and that was my spiritual upbringing. But it's hard to know that I'm internalizing this imagery from religions that have caused so much harm to myself and my ancestors.
Sure.
And but at the same time, I wanted to do like deep dive of research. So it's full of footnotes. And
Yeah.
that is the dissertation years talking. I don't think I can escape footnotes now.
Yeah.
Um,
Just on
so
that note,
that's where I
to
am.
interject, just
Yeah.
part of those footnotes, I have a list here looking at some of the things you talk about. You go from citing The Wizard of Oz to the Hebrew Bible, to Tupac, to the Christian New Testament, to the coding language C++, to Sylvia Plath, to the history of Turtle Island, and far and near, like between. It's fascinating reading. I was having such a good time yesterday, going through it. This citational kind of footnote thing, like these are really wide-ranging, diverse
Mhm.
sources. How were you thinking about that in your own work before we maybe get into a poem or two?
I'm not thinking of like I want to include ABC. Though everything that you just listed is all deeply integral to who I am as a person in terms of my history, my interests, my passions. Tupac, Sylvia, the Hebrew Bible, because like my doctoral work, when I tell people, okay, it's on the intersection of eating disorders and female poets, mostly Plath. But what I wanted to do with my dissertation,
Mhm.
which my supervisor says you can't, there's not enough information. And after all those years, I was told, actually, you could have. And my entire defense committee said, you could have written an entire thing on this. So what this is the concept through Sylvia's work of the forbidden fruit was probably a fig. And what does that mean? Since it's an
Oh,
inverted flower, it's inverted female genitalia, and ultimately the female wasp will die in the fig of starvation.
sure.
But I couldn't do an entire dissertation on that apparently. So this is my kind of
Oh,
this.
it's
Yeah, I'm gonna get it a little bit more in this collection.
fantastic. No, as someone who's currently writing his dissertation, I'm like, "Wow," like, "Jessica, I need to read that one. That one's I'm sure the one that you wrote was
I
fun." That
know
that's
the one I
fascinating.
wrote's okay, but I wanted to write the other one.
Yeah. Well, okay, so on this note of writing, of poetry, and then also some of the other forms,
Mhm.
there's this poem "Strength" that I was wondering if you could read for us, which, just to give a little bit of an intro to our audience, also really engages with the literary theme and tradition of horror.
Mhm.
So it's gonna be, if you have maybe kids in the audience, maybe we mute this for a second or listen to a time, whatever else. But I'd love to hear this poem and then hear how you're thinking about it.
Yeah, so first, hopefully this shows up on the screen okay. I'll show so this is what the Smith Rider-Waite strength card looks like.
Okay, great.
Any strength card, even if it's not Smith Rider-Waite, is gonna pay homage to that in some way.
Yep.
Before I read it, I think it's important to note you had no way of knowing this, but strength is my astrological card in
Huh,
terms of both my zodiac sign, which is Leo, and numerology, which is
okay.
8 on my birthday. So it's one of two cards that I consider mine. And so, yeah, I'll just dive right into reading it. So, strength. Even the loveliest leash is a means to submission, coronation to cowardice. Flowers are only great tricksters for bonnets and bees. My monster bursts forth from an alien womb we intercourse with intestines of blood gone beautiful. Docility bred through strokes, you look to me as your god, the woman who led you to green range and cowering tales. Tamed or damned, whips and hats attain the same as gentle, laughing, loving.
Whoa. Fascinating. So there seems to me, just on hearing this in your own voice, this kind of like pivot, right? There's like a back and forth. So it's tamed or damned. It's the loveliest leash is a means of submission, right? This critique. And then there's that striking moment in the center where the monster bursts forth. Really quite horrifying. What do you, if you take that characterization as being somewhere near to what the poem is doing, what do you make of that movement with that kind of intro and conclusion and then the quite horrifying moment in the middle?
I don't consider it horrifying. I consider it a birthing, which I guess some people could see as horrific. Obviously, the film Alien was in my mind with that one,
Oh,
and
yeah, yeah,
Alien
yeah.
being like, you know, her being the ultimate cat lady because the cat is saved at the end as well, and we're dealing with a lion here. I began writing this because if you look at the card, the lion is she's leashed the lion around her waist, and it also serves as like a flower crown as well. And she's wearing a matching crown.
Mm,
It began with my exploration of BDSM, which is another more like scholarly interest of mine. And I was doing a lot of work with that when I was in residence in Manhattan as well. Because the strength card lies, it's number 8 in the deck.
'kay.
And it said that 8 to get to strength is as far as most people can go in life in terms of their own evolution, in terms of attaining more wisdom. Very few people make it to number 9 and beyond.
Okay.
At number 8, for a very broad reading of this card, it's strength that is gleaned through gentleness.
Mhm.
And you probably noticed when you were reading it, I quote, I think, a couple of times the film The Secretary, because I consider that my favorite love story on film ever.
Okay.
And there's a line in another poem that says, from that film, something like, "Who says love needs to be soft and gentle?" And I
Sure.
believe it quoted by a clergy, maybe a priest. So that's how the poem began. And I credit a lot of how I write with these kind of images because of the fact that I grew up on horror films and I still
Okay.
love them. I think Indigenous people have a very different relationship to horror than other folks for
Okay.
multiple reasons.
Yeah. Well, okay, I wanna follow up on that then because one of the ways that you and I, became better friends was looking at a couple of your short horror stories
Yeah.
and, from a collection called Those We Feed, and I was wondering if you could share a little bit about that collection, and then talk a little bit about, not only horror as a genre, but, like, why do you think that Indigenous people I'm not gonna ask you to speak for all Indigenous people, but just generally, there might be some different engagements with horror than maybe with other more normative European kind of contexts.
Yeah. So I did not come to Notre Dame to write I always butcher this when I say it, Indigenous horror short story collection. Okay, I did it.
A lot of
Um,
lot of art.
oh, yeah. It just came to be, and I think it's because Indigenous horror is really having a moment right now.
Mm,
There is an anthology that is 80 something weeks on the bestseller list.
whoa,
It's called Never Whistle at Night. And whistling at night is kind of a pan Indigenous no that kind of summons not the greatest energies or spirits.
okay,
And I don't know, I had written a handful of short stories before, not horror. But like I said, grew up on horror. I vividly remember reading Stephen King and Dean Koontz when I was in 5th grade.
sure,
Um, for Indigenous people, obviously we've been facing horrors on this land for about 500 years.
right,
Oftentimes told through the settler colonial lens of us being the victims. And obviously there are vast disparities happening.
right,
When Indigenous people do appear in literature, in film, it's going to be through this white lens.
Mhm.
We are going to be dehumanized. We are going to be the ones where the bad things are happening to us. And at the same time, our own stories are being either lost or twisted or bastardized and not being shared. So the title of the collection, Those We Feed, stems from this story that was attributed to Aniyunwiya, but was not. And most people listening know the story. There's two wolves fighting inside us. One's good, one's bad. Which one wins? The one you feed.
Yeah, right.
Um, yeah. So, it's a beautiful little story. It was created by an evangelist who wanted to give it that, Indian twist.
Yeah.
And so that's what I set out to do with this collection. And as much as I hate to say this, it was difficult to write horror stories that featured Indigenous people, settings, some figures,
Mm,
and make sure that the people who were truly Indigenous do not become the victims.
sure.
And I think that's such internalized colonization, really.
Yeah, right, right, sure. It's also interesting, right, the way that systems of power kind of reflect and inflect expectations, right? In this film, person of this race or that background is always the first to go or always becomes the demonic possessed one or whatever. Even gender plays a role in this too.
Mhm.
And, yeah, that's fascinating and how those things inflect and reflect off each other. I mean, I remember looking at the story that we particularly worked on, which I believe is the title story, Those We Feed, or is it just a line? I'm trying to remember the name now.
It is. It is the title story. Yeah.
The title story, right. And, I I remember walking away feeling kind of haunted, and I was wondering if, like well, I it was we were talking about this a little bit, but I'd love to hear more about horror and haunting, and, like, do you see those as different genres, themes, or one as an expression of the other? Because, in many ways, looking at the history of Turtle Island, we're living in haunted times, haunted by the trauma, genocide, and massive violence that happened here in the last 500 years, right? And so I was wondering if, like, how you think about that theme, or even if it's a useful category for you as you think about your own work.
It is threaded throughout my work. But before I talk more about that, what you just said reminds me of that meme of like when everything's just going to hell. It's like everything's built on an Indian burial ground. No, wait. Like this is all built on an Indian burial ground. I mean,
Yeah,
burial was kind of used loosely considering all the unmarked graves. But
truly.
so yeah, another story in the collection. And the first that I wrote of this, but it was the very first. I wrote about Dear Lady, and Dear Lady is a multi-indigenous figure, including amongst the Aniyunwiya. And there's many stories that are related to her, but what I grew up learning was that Dear Lady is a figure who is mostly beautiful woman, and then she has hooved feet. So her purpose is to punish men who treat women badly.
Hmm,
And there was a great rendering of her in Reservation Dogs.
hmm,
So the title of that is Dear Lady, a haunting with the A editorial edited out. So haunting, hunting.
nice.
It was difficult to write that story because I felt like I needed to give her an origin story, which I've never heard an origin story really to Dear Lady. There have been a few that kind of hint at it, but not really.
Sure.
And I felt like for her to become this, you know, this being who takes on this role, that she needed to come from trauma. And so we
Hmm,
get back to that issue of my not wanting to make that be the case, but it was necessary. And then the thought of like, well, all of us Indigenous people did come from trauma, either ourselves or our ancestors, and usually our very close ancestors.
sure, sure.
So, I gave her that origin story and then turned her into the hunter instead of the hunted.
Mhm.
So I'm very into this whole haunting, hunting kind of interplay.
Yeah,
In terms of haunting and horror, I think that can be up to individual interpretation, but I don't think of haunting as necessarily inherently negative, but neither do I think of horror that way.
truly. Yeah.
Um, yeah, I also think it's because at least how I was raised and how my dad raised me, the separation between what we consider living and death is so much more fluid
Hmm.
and constantly evolving compared to what a lot of people think of. Whether folks are following an organized religion, like, oh, after death, there's heaven or hell, or after death, there's nothing.
Yeah.
I kind of sit more on the fence between all of that. Um, yeah. So I
Yeah.
don't know. It's not, we think of binary and good and bad, and I don't think of it that way.
No, and I think that's helpful even as a corrective to the not necessarily binary way I constructed the question, but like the more kind of categorical way. Those in betweenness, those interstices are where life happens, where history happens, where trauma is expressed. And so I think that's a helpful thing. And I just have to say that like I haven't seen the haunting story. After this sometime I have to read it because I love that turn of the phrase and kind of the context you gave for Dear Lady. Um so I on circling back to the poetry collection, if that's all right. Again, who would have thought the two poets are talking about poetry again and again? I was wondering if you could share with us one last poem, Three of Pentacles,
Mhm.
which in this story, I kind of really dovetails nicely with what we've been talking about in terms of violent histories, particularly and like reclamation, particularly of so-called Indian schools or native schools.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, would you be open to that?
Yeah. And I'll show the photo again. I have those ready. So this is Three of Pentacles. Typically, it's looked like there's a trio of people working on building the foundation of something.
Cool.
Looks kind of Gothic, church-like.
Cool.
Yeah. So Three of Pentacles. We were children, sown as seeds, no babies, gone to ghost. You interred us not in unmarked graves, buried sins and shames ill covered. Readily and rather, we took root in cherished gardens. Unearth us, capped to cradle, these bones never forgotten, tended, tender now, by Unisi hands. We are not your foundations, stem walls, and slabs for slaughter. Brick by brick, we are nations found, called home to ever blossom.
Yeah.
This is one of the poems that I did not write at Notre Dame, but was inspired by this card. It's 4 years old.
Okay.
It was written because, like, when I showed the card, I mean, that's what it looked like to me, that they are working on something that maybe it's not underground. Maybe it's just because it's so dark, it seems underground to me. But I
Sure.
wrote this poem specifically to accompany a series of visual works that I created in Portland, Oregon. It was part of the Glean project. And
Okay.
with Glean, a cohort of artists are asked to create a series using 90% materials gleaned from the Portland dump. And
Oh,
I went into this thinking I wanted to do something with eating disorders because that's always part. And there's going to be kitchen things, all kinds of like cool stuff like that. But I went and there were kitchen things, but they just didn't like talk to me.
mhm.
Instead, I initially fell in love with this. I'm not a construction person. This big slab of concrete that was shaped and had these like rusty wires sticking out. It looked so much like an anatomical heart to me.
Oh, okay.
And we were told there were some volunteers there. They're there every day. Since we were Glean artists, we could ask them, can you set it aside if we can't get it right now? And I asked for it. And this shows how little I know about this kind of thing. Like, that weighs about 600 pounds. But we'll try. It was just a slab of concrete. And I went back the next day. They couldn't move it. Can't blame them. But at the same time, somebody was there dropping off. They were clearly working on some kind of building project, a bunch of rebar. And so there were smaller pieces, a lot of bricks.
Mhm.
And they were just so such fascinating shapes to me, and they were being trashed, but they had initially been used, to build something.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time that this was happening, this was when the first big mainstream media unmarked graves in Canada was being reported on. And when I say unmarked graves, it's unmarked graves of Indigenous children who had been buried on either current or former residential sites.
Yeah.
Very, very brief history for anyone who doesn't know. So for a long, long time, Indigenous children were taken from their families and put in what was called Indian residential boarding schools, where they weren't allowed to speak their language, practice, anything related to their culture. Their hair was cut. A lot of, horrific things happened there. My dad survived residential. But as I was gleaning, this was in the summer of 2021, up in Canada, the phrase "we were children" was written in red paint on the doors of St. Paul's Cathedral in Saskatoon. And that was a previous residential site. So that's what spoke to me, like with creating this poem, with this tarot card, because, I said I've been reading for over 30 years. So whenever I see certain things, I can picture a card.
Sure.
And so with these materials, I chose 9. And I also gleaned a mid-century typewriter, onion skin paper somehow, glue and those kinds of things. The only thing that wasn't gleaned was the ink for the typewriter. And I wrote this poem, and it is kind of like paper mache on top of the pieces, and that's been in a couple of shows. But yeah, I wanted to put the poetry on a physical thing that represented these schools and the crumbling of them, of their foundations.
Yeah. And it's interesting, right? There's a kind of reclamation intention in this poem, which is like the sowing of seeds, and we took root, but then also at the same time you say we are not your foundation. Stem, walls, and slab for slaughter, brick by brick. So there's a building that's happening even in the face of the atrocity, but it's who's building, who gets to benefit from the building seems to be really, really clearly stated. At least at the ending. Is that I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you think about that ending and that tension in the poem between the incredible violence that it points to and also possible, maybe language of reclamation?
Yeah. So, it definitely is a reclamation. That's what I do with a lot of my work, because, all of these things were forced upon us. We are being literally walled in by these institutions. And that's why the non-tarot name of this poem and the name of the visual series is Strong Found Nations. And it's this, I did a similar series. It was a suspended series that kind of expanded from this, in which I hung infant body bags from ceilings. And because when it's this unearthing, and there's something so violent about that, not just about what happened to the children, obviously, but now this just like seemingly random digging. And yeah, it's I think it's a slow reclamation. A very common saying that, it didn't, I don't believe, began with Indigenous people on Turtle Island, but, they tried to bury us. They didn't know that we were seeds, is also like tied through my work. But it's not, I don't think, a choice that I use the collective we so much. And I think it's also reflecting who I am as a so-called mixed race person, because that's impossible to escape as well. I'm half my mother as well, and kind of facing that, not just inner conflict, overall conflict of how I came to be. I think there's a lot of that through that poem. And I feel like the poem ends on what seems like a very certain, confident note, but not necessarily, because what we were talking about is that in between of what is being called home, because that's so like biblical.
Yeah. Right. And again, like, when you start the last sentence is like, it starts with a not, like, we are not And you
Mhm.
go on to say, we are nations found, but even that, there's the kind of in-betweenness and maybe progress to it that doesn't point to some kind of certainty, at least in my reading. It's a direction maybe, but not a destination.
And it's
Um,
also because, I would say in what we call the United States, we are not even barely beginning to search in earnest. We are so far behind Canada. Not that
mhm.
Canada is so advanced in dealing with this, but compared to us, they are. I mean, I
Yeah,
don't know. I think the poem is also kind of a call for more action to be taken in this regard of
sure.
finding these children and
Yeah,
bringing them, you know, home. And when
right.
I say home, I don't mean in that sense. I mean in the in the Indigenous
No,
sense.
and so what explain that sense when you say bringing them home. What do you mean?
For example, I believe one of the Lakota tribes recently there was an unearthing in a
Mhm,
residential school that was not even in South Dakota, I don't think. But there was an entire ceremony of bringing these children back
mm,
to their ancestral land.
mm,
So I think, yeah, the ending of the poem was also a call for that for the government of this land to, I say government as if there's just one. I mean, there's sovereign tribal nations. So,
mm,
but what I mean is the U.S. government to look, to bring attention to this, and to aid tribes in finding our children and bringing them back to their ancestral lands.
mhm. Absolutely. Um, you've heard me say this quote many times that to love a nation involves critique and direct criticism and action against that nation to bring it into its values. And it's crazy to me that the basic notion of honor the treaties and, like, let's begin what is the smallest baby tiny step in the direction of remembering rightly has somehow, is not just has become controversial, but has been controversial for hundreds and hundreds of years, right?
Mhm.
And that permits this mass violence to continue even to this day. Um, Now, speaking of kind of direct action, I know um, you mentioned to me that you're going to a collective action training camp in so-called Rapid City, South Dakota. Um, and we've talked a lot about the arts and how the role that the art plays in working for justice and building positive peace and just peace. But I think both of us would say that that's not the only useful or only necessary method of seeking that kind of peace and justice. So I was wondering if you could share a little bit about what is this collective action training camp you're going to be attending in the next few weeks and what you're planning on doing.
Yeah, so I think by the time this airs, I will have already done it. So I'm speaking in the past. I am like my own ghost right now. But so the Indian Collective, NDN, three letters, is one of, if not the largest, Indigenous led and supporting nonprofits in what we call the United States. And I'm nervous, honestly. They get a lot done.
Hmm,
I'm incredibly impressed by their work. They have sting operations, often in South Dakota, to expose businesses that are exhibiting racism specifically to Indigenous people.
hmm,
But this training camp, I believe, is bringing 150 Indigenous folks and leaders to, I don't recall the name of it, but we are gathering at what is in the summer a Christian summer camp for children. And they are covering as much iconography as possible. We're getting these emails about it. And there's different tracks that you can join. One of them is arts based.
mhm,
And that would be a natural fit, right? And it's like what they're focusing on in arts is creative resistance strategies.
sure.
I'm not sure exactly what that's going to entail. And might not ever know what all it entails because I'm like, I'm not going to do that track. I
Mhm,
wanted to do something more physical and bodily based. So I'm like, let's do tactical climbing yeah. So I'm going to be spending 7 days learning how to scale walls for 5 hours a day. And that was obviously a very conscious decision.
sure.
Um, I don't know. I think sometimes when you're a poet or any other kind of artist, when you identify as anything, you get stuck in these ruts of like, I'm going to keep going, because you can always grow and learn more. But I just
Right.
need something wildly different right
Mm.
now.
Sure.
And I'm curious to see how that will feed into other areas of my work as well. I'm sure there'll be poems about it. Give
Yeah.
me 6 months.
Yeah. I look forward to reading them. But again, I think what your work does before this and continues to do is to really challenge the boundary of what's on the page and what's not. What's a poem, like, is living a poem, right? Is
Mhm.
what is performance and what is not. And when we talk about the question of justice and real positive peace, you know, the questions of action, the questions of collective action and collective reading, collective writing really do come together. Now, we've been talking for a while now, and so I was thinking I would ask one more question if that's all right, and then maybe pivot to a close. But it's kind of wrapping things up in this conversation. We've had a really rich conversation. It's ranged from many different things. Um, and I'll confess, as someone who's getting a PhD in poetry, I have many technical thoughts on the question that is to follow. But for those in the audience, again, who maybe are new to poetry or are suspicious of it, or maybe even embarrassed of it, as my student was, what would you say about kind of a broader statement about poetry and justice, poetry and peace? What do those things have to say to each other, and why?
I think that's a very personal question. For me, poetry is the necessary balm to foster peace and justice, both within myself and branching outward. I hear a lot of poets say something like, they need to write. I definitely need to write. I saw one therapist very briefly she was aware of what I did as a living. In terms of just making money, I owned a writing editing agency for 11 years. And she told me, if you weren't already a writer, I would prescribe writing, like journaling, something like that.
Mhm,
Because, yeah, you would need to write, and trauma feeds psychosis.
mhm.
But clearly, you've been self medicating through writing for years.
Yeah.
So that's what I was told. And I believe that there's definitely, there are times where physically, on a physical level, I need to write, and it's almost always poetry. I never wake up in the middle of the night like, I really need to get this outline for a short story down or for this scholarly article. When you wake up in the middle of the night and need to write, for me at least, I need to write poetry.
Yeah, I'll be honest, I've never woken up in the middle of the night and, felt the need to work on my dissertation chapter. Please don't tell my advisor that, but, no, that makes sense. I have a nighttime journal with poetry right by my bed as well. Um And I think also, the way that you're talking about this, it's really interesting as both a scholar of poetry, but also as someone who's friends with you, just to see how you alternate between the individual and the collective so naturally. You talked a lot about the collective we in your work, but then you're also talking about personal trauma and also societal trauma and how those things are filtering through and into each other. And it seems like poetry is a really generative container, method, means, and end in which you express and encounter that. And so, um, I've been thinking, I've been sitting with your work for around maybe a little less than a year now, one school year at least. And as I was preparing for this, there was one particular poem that really, really moved me. And I wanted to actually leave our audience with this, if that's all right with you. Is that all right?
Absolutely.
Okay. So it was your tarot poem, Five of Pentacles. It ties together your commitment to indigenization, to place and space, to a precise ear for the poetic line. And so I'm going to share it now, just parts of it, a selection. You write, quote, "We are not the removed. We are the movement." And later in the poem, quote, "We resist, persist, plant our pasts and futures, sacrification to emerge from germination, self sowed, unowned." Thanks, Jessica, for sharing your work with us.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This is great.
So fun, right? And thanks also to the audience for tuning in. You can find more information about Jessica and her work at all one word, all lowercase, thisCherokeeRose.com. If you'd like to explore more from Indigenous voices and over 85 other Think ND series, please visit at think.nd.edu. Please feel free to tell your friends as well. Think ND is open to all. And until next time, inspire your mind and spark conversations. Thanks, everyone.